So basically, hardly ever do this, but there was a comment that somebody posted on my YouTube channel that I thought was just begging for me to make a video responding to it. And you'll see what I mean. This comment just needed a video so badly. Q. By the way, the person posting the comment was Pointless Bun Cum. And they spelled cum with a K, which is really creative. And their avatar is an upside down head of lettuce. And they're responding to another YouTube user. Anyway, Q, do you think you could tackle my question I left for you? A, okay. Q, what defeated creation science, or how was creation science defeated? A, reality was the culprit mainly. The method was death by 1,000 cuts. Smiley face. Let's talk about the scores to examine what I mean by defeated. Academia. Creation science relegated to the backwaters. Science classroom. Despite furious attempts, it is effectively, officially, banned. Courtroom repeatedly routed. Industry, useless. YouTube, internets, laughingstock. Attempts to reinvent into intelligent design. Shallow, obvious, lame. Failure to gain any traction. In parentheses, you can list other categories and give your opinion where you think creationism has succeeded, e.g. all the churches in the swamps of Mississippi. So, basically, according to this person, so creationism's wrong because on YouTube, internet, it's a laughingstock. Because people laugh at something on YouTube, that apparently means that it's wrong. So never mind all the scientific arguments for creation, never mind the fact that we have hundreds of dating methods showing that the Earth is young and only a handful showing that the Earth is old, never mind the evidence. It's laughed at on the YouTube, so therefore it must be wrong. Yeah, just brush it away. It's wrong. It's laughed at on YouTube. Look at it. Let's go back to the 1800s for a minute. Just in your mind, hop into a time machine. Let's go back to the 1800s. There was a little something I like to call spontaneous generation. Basically, people thought that if you mixed together a bunch of broth with the right chemicals in it, you could spontaneously see living things arise by chance. Just through the chemical processes interacting. At the time, people thought bacteria was very simple, so it was just a blob of protoplasm. So the idea of them forming by natural processes didn't seem all that unreasonable. And people actually thought for a long time this is how you got infectious diseases. Bacteria would spontaneously form in your body, and that's how you would get an infectious disease. They didn't know about epidemiology yet. They discovered it in the 1800s, but they didn't know about it yet. During this time period, you had people like Louis Pasteur. And some of you may have learned about him, about Louis Pasteur and other microbiologists and medical doctors of the time, who basically discovered germ theory and modern medical hygiene. So I'm going to collectively talk about all these guys as a group, rather than talking about each one individually. Basically, what they did was they set out to disprove spontaneous generation. They said, you know what, I don't think spontaneous generation is right. And what they did is they would set up experiments where they would take the broth and they would boil it in order to sterilize it. And then this pot of broth would be looked at in sterile conditions, and living things would never form spontaneously in there. Other scientists, the spontaneous generation people, would repeat the experiments, but they used a different broth. And they did get spontaneous generation, or at least that's what it appeared. People like Louis Pasteur ended up repeating their repeat of the original experiments, and they found that what it was is they just weren't boiling the liquid for long enough. Now, why do I say all that? What was the motive for saying that spontaneous generation was wrong? They don't generally tell you in science classrooms. Usually maybe they ate some bad pizza. It's weird to talk about bad pizza, and they had a dream that spontaneous generation was wrong. They don't really tell you. But basically what it was is they read the Bible, and they saw that life comes from life. Then of course you had, and Wish I could talk about that more, but perhaps more detail about this in a future video. Then you also had medical doctors who were, at the time, what medical doctors did was they would do like an autopsy, rinse their hands off in some stagnant bowl of water, and wipe it off in their apron, go deliver a baby. You and I know that that is insane. But back in this day, they didn't know. They didn't understand about infectious disease transferring from host to host. They thought that it spontaneously arose in the body. So you had medical doctors who were Christians, and I think at least one was Jewish, who were reading the Bible. And they saw that, hey, in the Bible, it says to wash your hands with running water. Or, no, it doesn't say to wash your hands with running water. It says running water is clean. So if you have basically a dead animal, and it falls into stagnant water, like a jar of water, then that water is unclean. But if you have a river and a animal comes along, it dies, it falls in the river, washes down the river, that water is still clean. You can still use that water to drink from. Hopefully, personally, you probably want to wait a little bit for the deer to be down the river. But the water in the jar could never become clean again. The water in that river was still clean. So they said, okay, you know what? We're going to start washing our hands with running water. And they were these doctors who were Christians, or Jewish, were telling the doctors under them, wash your hands with running water before you go deliver a baby. And of course, their doctors under them were probably mumbling, oh, you're pushing your religious beliefs on us. But, you know, this is the 1800s. They didn't have the ACLU running around trying to ruin everything. So they said, you know what, fine, we'll go wash our hands with running water because that's what the boss is telling us to do. The mortality rate in the hospitals dropped. And now before this, of course, it was more dangerous to have your baby at the hospital than it was to just have your baby at home. This made hospitals a lot cleaner. So basically, by studying things like the book of Leviticus, by studying things like the book of Leviticus, we were able to get modern medical hygiene. People say that creation science hasn't contributed anything to science, don't know what they're talking about. Because creation science gave us modern medical hygiene. Creation science gave us germ theory. And you know what? In recent decades, about 15 years ago, if you go back in time about 15 years, people were talking about junk DNA. They were saying, well, the vast majority of the human genome is junk. The reasoning behind this was they were looking at the genome, and they were saying, okay, about 3% of this codes for proteins. We don't know what the rest does. Well, since we don't know what the rest does, it must be junk. It must not do anything. And then, of course, they were saying, well, because it's junk, that means that no intelligent designer, no God could have been behind this. And if there was no designer behind the human genome, then that proves that it must be the result of evolution. So they're using junk DNA as evidence for evolution. Now, of course, if you look at that argument, there's an obvious dichotomy in there. A lot of times evolutionists try to accuse intelligent design advocates or creationists of creating a false dichotomy. But in reality, you really do have a dichotomy to an extent. You have two basically umbrella categories, and there is spectrum in between. But for the most part, you basically do have a dichotomy. It's just because you have a dichotomy does not mean it's a false dichotomy. Something can be either A or not A. Something can be either A or B. Every once in a while, you don't really have a C option, or sometimes things can be a combination of A and B. But there is an obvious dichotomy here. Now, people who are scientists in the intelligent design movement and scientists who are creationists were predicting, we're saying, you know, we predict that the vast majority of this DNA that's so-called junk will be found to have a function. It will be found to be functional. And so you had evolutionists saying, well, it doesn't have a function because we don't know what it does. So this was really evolution hampering science. This was evolution holding science back because it was declaring things like junk DNA to be functionless. And kind of the same thing they did with the appendix, where it kind of held back research on the appendix because it was declared to be a useless leftover of evolution. Today, if you go talk to a geneticist, the idea of junk DNA is an outdated term. There may be a few regions of the DNA, in the genome that may not have a function. They may have lost their function since the time of creation. Or, it can always be that it has a function, we just don't know what it is. You can't really declare something to be totally functionless unless you know absolutely everything there is to know about that particular thing. And evolutionists it was actually an evolutionist that originally pointed that out with vestigial organs. Anyway, next part of this person's comment says, let's conduct a thought experiment. Imagine that you were a creationist mechanic. Imagine that you thought cars were made and originated with divine spells from unseeable ghosts. Imagine that you came up with 1,000 arguments as to why other mechanics were wrong and you were right. Imagine you were laughed at by other mechanics. Imagine you were refuted by other mechanics. Imagine you were banned from mechanics classes in schools. Imagine you were never published in mechanical journals. Imagine you were repeatedly defeated in your court cases. I wonder if there is such things as mechanical journals. Anyway, imagine the other mechanics that believed in the ghosts did not accept the cars were made by divine spells. And he puts divine spells in quotation marks. Imagine you reinvented creationist mechanics as intelligent mechanics to seem less magical, and you still got no traction. Imagine that you had a creationist mechanic research institute, complete with a smattering of grease-fingered creationist mechanics, but you had no workshop and never worked on any cars. Imagine you promised the creationist ghosts that you'd never ever give up your belief in magical creationism no matter what. Now imagine for me how on God's green earth that could be considered anything other than massive, continuous, constant defeat with utter collapse only prevented by dogged, pointless defiance. Now look it. If I'm going to a mechanic, he better darn well believe in intelligent mechanics. He better believe in intelligent mechanics, otherwise I'm taking my car somewhere else. I'm going to be honest with you. Basically, this is an evolutionist posting this, by the way. And he's really making my point for me, because you know what? Let's imagine this whole thing. Let's imagine that you did have a mechanic who said, you know what, I think that the Model T car was designed by Henry Ford, or the guy working for Henry Ford. Whatever. Imagine that you did have a car mechanic saying, you know, I think the cars were designed by intelligent agents. And you had the other mechanics laughing at him. Come on. This guy's making my point for me. Yeah, you know what? Let's imagine we go to Mars, and let's say that there were 2 geologists on Mars. And let's say they were looking at a cliffside, and they walk around the corner, and there's a giant face of some kind of insectoid creature, something that looks like a half insect, half human face coming out of the rock, because it's clearly carved. Now imagine one guy saying, oh wow, this is clearly evidence that there was a civilization here on Mars. And the other guy saying, well, you don't know anything about what the intelligent agent was that made this. Therefore, you can't consider that it was an intelligent agent. Imagine the one guy saying, oh, well, you're not allowed to consider the possibility of intelligence because that's not allowed in science. We're only allowed to consider natural processes. You know, the idea that some magical alien race carved this out of the side of the mountain is exempt from science because that's against the rules. Now, of course, the second geologist would say, well, you know what? Do you have any real scientific explanation for how it got there? Because the best explanation is clearly, the best and most scientific explanation is that somebody carved this. And the evolutionist equivalent, the other geologist might say, well, you know what? Here's a just so story. And you might give them some vague just so story about how that got carved out of the mountain. And the guy saying that it was intelligent might say, No, that's just a just so story, and that really isn't science. It's just a just so story with a little bit of scientific lingo thrown over the top of it to make it look good. And imagine the other guy saying, well, you know what? Just because we don't know how it happened naturally, just because we don't know all the details, doesn't prove that some magical alien beings made this cliff face. Or now, obviously that's not meant to be a reference to that face on Mars that people say is on there, but anyway, this guy's making my point for me. Just because everybody's laughing at you does not make you wrong. If you have a mechanic saying, you know, I think somebody made these cars, even if you had no history of Henry Ford, even if you knew nothing about who made that particular car, or who made that face in the side of a mountain, even if you know nothing of the engineer behind it, you can still say that something's designed. I've seen a lot of evolutionists make this nonsense argument that if you don't know, if you can't sit there and interview the intelligent agent who made something, you cannot consider the possibility of intelligence. And of course, that's a bunch of nonsense. Even if it came out tomorrow that the ancient Egyptians did not build the pyramids, and we didn't know who did, nobody would doubt that they were the result of some kind of intelligence. This whole argument is a bunch of nonsense. Obviously, cars are created. If I'm going to a mechanic and he's fixing my car, he better believe that they were the result of intelligent mechanics. Now, this was posted on a video where I challenged the audience to take your top 10 arguments for evolution, write them down, and see what scientists who are creationists and intelligent design advocates have to say. PhD scientists who really know what they're talking about. And, you know, I went into all that. I talked about how, you know, people might just dismiss a scientist because they're creationists, or dismiss them because they're intelligent design and assume that they're lying. I talked about all that in the video. But I find it interesting that rather than address the actual facts and talk about his actual top 10 arguments for evolution, this person just said, well, because the majority disagrees with creation, that makes creation wrong. Because it's the laughing stock on the internet, because people laugh at it, it's therefore wrong. Obviously, this is a bunch of nonsense, and anybody with any type of rational thought can see that. And of course, with this mechanical creationism, intelligent mechanics, as he called it. You know what? Believing a car that is designed doesn't mean that I think it was created by a magical spell. There's a difference. Besides, Christians. Magic in its true form is not part of the biblical worldview. When you're doing a magical spell, you know, people who are into Wicca and voodoo and this sort of thing, if you're sitting down and you're doing a magical spell, there's only two, and you're getting results, there's only two real sources that power is going to come from. Well, actually, either you're going to have it where God is not going to be behind that. However, if you're sitting down and using the garlic that God made to do a spell to treat somebody of their cold, it might just very well be that, hey, the garlic has natural scientific properties that have treated somebody of their cold. Or you may have some demonic activity in there. But magic in its true form, the way that pagans believe in magic, is not part of the Christian worldview. And that's actually a part of how science was able to originate. Because the early scientists were Christians and they believed in a rational, logical creator who was consistent and unchanging, they thought the universe must therefore work by rational, logical laws that they could understand. They thought, well, we can understand the universe in a rational, logical way through consistent, unchanging laws. And hence, that's how modern science was born. And that's not just me saying that. Historians of science agree that that's how it worked. It wasn't that, oh, well, you had this Christian superstition that was holding science back, and science pushed forward and made it through in spite of Christianity. No, it was actually because of the Christian belief in a God who is rational and logical that the idea that the universe was rational and logical also became possible. The last comment that this person has, or the last section of his comment, says this. This is what being wrong looks like. This is what defeat looks like. This is creationism's defeat. Peace. Further note, creationism is and always was a deeply religious Christian evangelical apologetic tool to wave a last flag of panic, defiance, and fear that God might be unemployed. It has always been strongly biased, bigoted, and dishonest. It has only done harm to the reputation of God and His Scripture by presenting it as childish, stupid, unbelievable fantasy. You may not know, but as early as 250-ish AD, St. Augustine Hippo was arguing that Genesis was not literal. Last piece of wisdom. Ancient writers were less concerned about the facts and more concerned with truths. Our concern, fixation with facts, is more a reflection of our modern scientific methods. I say, again, ancient writers are more concerned with truths, not as concerned with facts. Genesis is about truth, not about facts. Genesis 1:24. Let the earth bring forth living creatures. Peace. Now, there's a lot of errors in what he's saying here. First off, again, he's making the appeal to the majority. He's made the fallacious error a lot of times here that creationists don't do research. But they do. And intelligent design advocates also do research and get published in mainstream scientific journals. Unfortunately, secular journals these days have in spite of the bias secular journals have, there are articles in the mainstream literature that are peer-reviewed that argue for intelligent design. They're out there. And they were out there even during the Dover trial when the judge declared there have been no peer-reviewed articles saying that there are no peer-reviewed articles arguing for intelligent design in the scientific literature. Yeah, there were. He was just factually wrong on that. There were actually several at the time. But when your conclusion is 90% identical to what the ACLU handed to you, including typographical errors, don't expect it to be a fair and balanced and honest courtroom decision. Rather expect it to be the result of an immoral judge. And yeah, I said it. 90% identical to the ACLU, what the ACU handed him. Come on. What this person may not know is that in Hebrew, because this person's gotten into the theology, I will too. In Hebrew, they had two basic formats for how they wrote their literature. They had a format for how they wrote their history, and they had a format for how they wrote their poetry. It's very popular these days to say, well, maybe Genesis was poetry. However, it's written as history. In Hebrew, they had a format for how they wrote their history, and that's how Genesis was written. Some people have said, well, maybe the days are really long periods of time, and that's how it can fit with evolution or progressive creationism. Even if you grant that, the days are in the wrong order. Basically, what I mean by that is that you have birds being created before land-dwelling reptiles. You have the earth being created before the sun, etc. So, if you believe in evolution and you try to say, well, maybe the days of Genesis were just long periods of time, well, you got a problem theologically if you're trying to fit that with the Bible, because the order that things were created, if you believe in evolution, is in the wrong order. And same with progressive creationism. And of course, progressive creationism also teaches that there was no global flood. Old Earth ideas almost always teach that there was no global flood, yet the Bible very clearly teaches that there was a global flood. Also, Adam, for example, he's included in the genealogies leading up to Jesus Christ. He's not, it's very clear that he wasn't intended to be a mythical figure. The Apostle Paul also talks about Adam's sin. He talks about how Adam's sin brought death, disease, and suffering into the world. Adam's sin brought the fall and the curse into the world. So the entire universe is groaning in pain because of Adam's sin. It is Christ's death and suffering that frees us from that sin. If you believe in evolution and you're a Christian, or if you believe in progressive creationism and you're a Christian, then you believe that God created, if you believe in evolution, you believe that God created the world through death, disease, and suffering. If you believe in progressive creationism, you believe that death, disease, and suffering have been here throughout God's creation. The cross makes no sense. The Bible says that death is God's enemy. Jesus healed the blind. Jesus healed the sick. He hates leprosy. If you believe in evolution, you think that leprosy was just a part of God's very good creation. Jesus going around healing people makes no sense. Jesus dying, if you believe that physical death, disease, and suffering are part of God's very good creation, then why did Jesus have to physically suffer and die on the cross? If physical death and suffering are not the punishment for sin, then what is this business? Why does the Bible say that Jesus Christ was taking our punishment for us by physically dying on the cross and being resurrected? Now, Christians believe that everybody will one day, again, or at least the Bible teaches that everybody will one day be resurrected. Death is a temporary state. Those who have accepted Jesus Christ will enter into eternity in heaven. Those who rejected Jesus Christ will spend eternity in hell. It's very simple. Unfortunately, I think a lot of preachers have oversimplified it because they've so compromised with evolution. They make it sound like it's totally arbitrary. Follow my religion or go to hell. But that's not what it is. It's that everybody was going to hell because we've all sinned. Because we've all chosen to continually reject God. But Jesus dying on the cross made a way for us. Christianity isn't just some arbitrary religion that God wanted us to have blind faith in. He didn't say have blind faith in this religion or go to hell. That's not what it is. The facts supporting Christianity are very strong and they are overwhelming. Romans 1:20 says that if you reject God, the creation makes God so obvious. God's handiwork, God is so obvious because of creation that if you reject Him, you have no excuse. That's what the Bible teaches. And also, Book of Exodus, God wrote the Ten Commandments with His own hand, with His own finger. There's almost no place in Scripture where God actually wrote words with His own finger. There's a few, but not many. There's only 2 off the top of my head that I can think of. 3 if you count Jesus writing in the dirt. But we don't actually know what He wrote in the dirt, so. In the Book of Exodus, God gives the 10 Commandments to Moses, writes it with His own finger. And it says that because God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th, so are you to do work for 6 days and rest on the 7th. The same Hebrew word is used. The word is yom. Now some people try to say, well, the word yom can mean long period of time. Yes, it can, but only in certain contexts. Genesis is not one of those. Genesis 1 specifically is not one of those. The word yom can mean a long period of time, but not when it's used with the terms evening and morning or when it's used with a number. In the Genesis, it is explicitly clear. There is no place more explicitly clear that the word day means an ordinary day than Genesis 1. The author was spelling out very clearly that the day meant an ordinary day. You have to violate all the rules. You have to violate all kinds of rules of Hebrew in order to make yom mean a long period of time. And actually, a letter was written to the top Hebrew experts at places like Harvard, Yale, these Ivy League schools. Somebody took the time to write a letter to these top professors of Hebrew and asked them, based purely on the text, was the author of Genesis intending for these to be ordinary days or undefined periods of time? Not everybody sent a letter back, but most did. And they, totally unanimously, every single one of them said the author of Genesis, based purely on the text intended for these to be ordinary days. So, anyway, thank you for taking the time to watch my video. Please feel free to check out my websites. They'll come up here in a minute. Greenslug.com, slug is spelled with 2 G's, that's my blog. I have a creation versus evolution section on there. Also, check out my other videos on my YouTube channel. And check out, if you're a science major, or you're just interested in science, or you're a researcher, check out blueslug.com. Again, slug is spelled with 2 G's. That's a science search engine that I put together. Please check these things out. Let me know what you think. And thank you for taking your time to watch my video. This is Greg, out.